frozen.
And joining.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us. Welcome to the inaugural episode of our Brown Bag webinar series on disaster displacement indicators, in particular as it relates to the use of those indicators in understanding future risks of displacement linked to climate change. My name is Victor Bernard, and I'll be your host for today. This webinar series is a collaborative initiative of the International Organization for Migration, IOM's Climate Mobility Innovation Lab, the University of the Philippines Resilience Institute, and the Asian Institute of Technology, along with partners from our co-creation hub. Together, our aim is to raise awareness and foster dialogue on the various dimensions of climate displacement. To begin, I would like to invite Mr. Bradley Melliker to share his opening remarks and introduce IOM's recently launched Climate Mobility Innovation Lab, the Risk Index for Climate Displacement, or RICD, the Co-Creation Hub, and the Climate Catalytic Fund. Mr. Melliker is the new head of the Climate Mobility Innovation Lab for Asia and the Pacific. Previously, he served as the Senior Regional Emergency and Post-Crisis Specialist, focusing on disaster risk reduction, emergency preparedness, humanitarian response, and recovery across Asia and the Pacific. He has held several other roles within IOM, including assignments in Iraq, Guinea, Cameroon, the Philippines, Haiti, and Timor-Leste. So the floor is yours, Brad.
Thank you very much, Victor. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes, Brad.
Okay. Thanks so much, Victor, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining this inaugural episode of our Brown Bag webinar series. As Victor mentioned, these webinars are taking place in partnership with the University of the Philippines Resilience Institute and AIT as part of IOM's Climate Mobility Innovation Lab, which was just recently launched here in Asia and the Pacific. The Climate Mobility Innovation Lab is a mechanism created by IOM to support various partners, to work with various partners around the region as it relates to challenges linked to climate change and human mobility. So you will hear a lot more about the lab, I hope, in the coming weeks and months, but this is the first of our Brown Bag series. I want to talk a little bit about this episode today and where it sits in terms of the lab's work. There are a few innovations that we've been working on as part of even before and now as part of the lab, the Climate Mobility Innovation Lab. The first is the Risk Index for Climate Displacement, RICD. And here, this is a tool that we are in the process of creating, which will really help us in having more granular and specific and operational data as it relates to the risks that people may face in the future of displacement linked to climate change. We see this as a collaborative tool between a variety of partners. We're doing this through co-creation. So there's a network of scientists, academics, universities, policymakers, and other experts who are collaborating on the development of this tool, as well as its application in multiple countries in the region. We're piloting this in Philippines, Indonesia, and Fiji, hence the topic of today's discussion. But you'll hear more, hopefully, about RICD over the course of the webinar today, as well as in the future. We also will establish a new fund, a Climate Catalytic Fund, which will seek to support local authorities, civil society actors, private sector, amongst others, in addressing some of the key challenges that people will face, the risk factors that go into displacement, basically. So what we're aiming at is trying to prevent displacement from occurring for people who want to stay, build resilience in general, and enhance preparedness overall. So the RICD itself is the RICD is being created through this mechanism that we've established, the co-creation hub. We have, as I mentioned, a number of scientists and experts, around 30, all of whom come from Asia and the Pacific. We are developing this because of the technical complexity of this topic, as well as because we want this to be sort of designed and owned and used by different entities, whether it's universities or governments or local actors, etc., in the countries concerned. So as a UN agency, we see our role as one of convening and of bringing together all of these different minds that can collaborate on the development of this tool. This mechanism was created earlier this year, and we've had a series of different events so far going forward. Obviously, the core development of the data tool of RICD is a main focus of the co-creation hub. We will soon launch a small grants mechanism to support targeted research on this topic related to climate-induced displacement, and then this brown bag webinar series, which we're starting right now. Just a little bit more background on RICD before I pass the floor back to Victor and we can get started. The tool itself, as I mentioned, we're really aiming to provide more operational data that will help us understand risk in the future, risk of people having to move as a result of the impacts of climate change. We know that there are millions of people in Asia and the Pacific who get displaced every year as a result of disasters, as well as some of the slow onset impacts of climate change. We really want to understand what the future looks like for many people who may face some of these challenges in the future. We look at the tool at two levels. Sort of the first relates to what are the sort of background or underlying factors that might make displacement more or less likely to occur. And here we're talking about environmental factors, certainly, as well as political, economic, cultural, demographic, and other factors. But we don't see these as necessarily the main reasons why people move, right? The main reasons why people move, the immediate catalysts of displacement, we see more as livelihood insecurity, food and water insecurity, loss of territory, loss of housing, and other factors. Of course, historical displacement data plays an enormously important role in understanding either of these phenomenon, drivers of displacement or triggers of displacement. Hence the importance of a discussion like this today, as well as the work that IDMC and other partners are doing related to collecting and analyzing displacement data. So with that in mind, I will stop there. I just wanted to say a few words, first of all, to introduce the Climate Mobility Innovation Lab, as well as frame where this discussion fits in terms of some of the work that we're trying to do in understanding future risk related to climate-induced displacement. So with that, I'll pass back to Victor, and I wish you a great rest of the webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad, for that very insightful overview of the Climate Mobility Innovation Lab and its pioneering projects on climate displacement. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce our main speaker for today, Dr. Thanalechmi Huset, or Dr. Lechmi. Dr. Lechmi will present on disaster displacement indicators, drawing on the experiences of Indonesia and the Philippines in tracking displacement in disaster contexts. Dr. Lechmi is a research manager at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, bringing over 13 years of research and analytical expertise to the field of internal displacement. Before joining IDMC, Dr. Lechmi served as a senior consultant with the International Labour Organization, focusing on socioeconomic issues. She also worked as a policy advisor and key account manager for Asia and the Pacific at the International Organization of Employers, where she advocated for business-friendly policies. Her career began as an economist at Sureco Erasme, a think tank in Paris, where she analyzed research and development policies for the European Commission and contributed to the World Input-Output Database. Dr. Lechmi holds a PhD and dual master's degrees in economics from the Université Paris, Panthéon Sorbonne. She's fluent in English, Tamil, Mandarin, and French. She's originally from Singapore, where she also completed her undergraduate studies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lechmi. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Victor, for handing me the floor. I'm very delighted to be here this morning. Well, this very early morning for me. Good morning, good afternoon, distinguished guests joining me today online. It's really a pure pleasure to be here, kickstarting the first Brown Bag session as part of our RICD Co-Creation Hub series. Now, Asia and Pacific is a region that I've spent almost half my career working on. And as Victor mentioned, I'm also from the region. So there goes my double pleasure of being here. Now, before we start getting into the nitty-gritty details of my presentation, I wanted to have a short opening session to just get the ball rolling. Now, can I ask all participants to raise your virtual hands if you agree with the following statements that I will be reading out soon? Is that clear? I don't see a lot of hands. Okay, I'm starting to see some. Perfect. So let's start with the first question that I have for you. Now, how many of you have heard of internal displacement before joining us today? Lovely. I'm seeing a group of connoisseurs. I see almost 17 hands raised and more going up. That's good to hear. Now, all hands down. The next question I have for you is, how many of you understand what displacement is? One hand more going up. Very good. So I'm speaking to a group of experts here. That is very good to note. Yes, hands down one more time. And the next question I have is, do you agree with the following statement? Displacement is different from migration. Those who agree, raise your hands. Wonderful. I have 20, 30 over hands being raised, so you all agree that displacement is quite different. Now, the last question is, how many of you are actually tired of this exercise? Okay, thank you for indulging me in this. All hands down, and let me now start my presentation proper by explaining to you why this exercise was, well, fun for me. It's to get our juices running, but it's also to help explain what is displacement. Now, it's good that I'm speaking with a group of experts here who understand and who are aware that displacement is quite distinct from migration. So here I present to you the UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, defining what internal displacement is. But just very quickly to sum up, as all of you know, displacement is quite different from migration in two aspects. The first is the element of choice. Displacement is involuntary, meaning this is not something that people choose to do, but they are forced to do. Internal displacement also is quite distinct from migration in the sense that it occurs within national borders. So typically migration, if we're not talking about internal migration, we're looking at cross-border movements, but displacements tends to be very national and within national boundaries. So these are the two elements that makes it stand out quite a little bit. Based on the definition provided in the UN Guiding Principles here, you can see that displacement can be a result of a variety of drivers: armed conflict, situations of violence, disasters, and human rights violations. But for this afternoon, my focus will be on specifically disaster displacement. So when disasters occur, you do have certain responses and impacts, one of which is actually human mobility. Human mobility, specifically displacement, can happen at various points in time of a disaster. They can happen before the disaster strike, and in that sense, we're talking about preemptive evacuation. Most of you should be well aware of this. When there's a disaster that is imminent, people who know that the disaster is approaching would typically also be forced to leave their homes to protect their lives. And this preemptive evacuation happens before the disaster strikes. Now, evacuation or displacement can also happen while the event is ongoing. Typically, in the case of earthquakes, you have the ground shaking and then people starting to evacuate and move to avoid the damages related to that event. Sometimes you can also have displacement happening after the disaster has struck, after a cyclone, a tsunami. As people start to rebuild their lives, they would realize that their homes have been destroyed and they would have to stay away from them while they reconstruct. In all of these types of mobility, displacement can take all these forms at different phases of the disaster. And all of these would require different ways of approaching mitigating those impacts. People who tend to be preemptively evacuated only are evacuated for a couple of days, as long as they do not have more lasting impacts. Some people could also be temporarily displaced if their home is intact, but they might have lost access to electricity, so they would then have to stay away from their homes with friends or families while electricity or power lines are being restored. Now, displacement can also be more long-lasting, and this is what we call protracted kind of displacements, when actual and severe damages are incurred. For instance, very typically, you have your home being destroyed, and so you have to move away from home while you're rebuilding, which could take months or years, you would be displaced. So each of this displacement, as you can see, are quite distinct, although they all come under this umbrella of displacement. But they do require very different responses. And as government and stakeholders try to regulate and manage different types of movements and impacts related to disasters, they would require to know how to address them with a very targeted approach. As you can appreciate, different forms of displacement would require different approaches, different kind of assistance, and to know that at the end of it, you do need data. Data on the number of people displaced, the number of people displaced per type, the amount of time they would be displaced for, are some of the key information that they require to come up with targeted responses. So now what you see before you on the slide is at the midway of the Sendai implementation, Sendai framework implementation. So the Sendai framework from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, is to last between 2015 to 2030, and halfway in 2022, we did a sort of assessment to see how countries are doing in terms of reporting. Specifically, we focused on reporting on displacement. Now, even UNDRR has recognized the importance of displacement and has called to include indicators on displacement to complement existing indicators. They specifically recommended that data be collected on the 4 indicators you see before you: number of people preemptively evacuated, number of people displaced during and after disasters, number of houses destroyed, and also the duration of displacement. Now, you can see this assessment done for the 65 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. What is quite promising is the number of countries that are either systematically reporting on these indicators and the number of countries that are partially reporting on these indicators. So it's quite a high amount combined between these 2 types of reporting, and halfway through or midway through the Sendai framework implementation, it is quite an encouraging sign to see more and more countries realizing the importance of reporting on displacements. And as these countries do partial reporting, they are trying to test out ways to integrate these indicators into their current systems. So we are hopeful by 2030, a majority of these countries will be systematically reporting on these indicators, and you have very few countries that are not actually reporting. This is our hope, and as you can see in the midway point, this is quite an encouraging piece of news. Now, to support countries' efforts to report on disaster displacement indicators, back in 2021, IOM together with IDMC decided to come up with the list of indicators that countries should adopt to report on displacement. Now, to get there, first, we did a very thorough and extensive literature review on existing data sources, approaches, and efforts countries have already implemented. So you can use the barcode here to access the full reports. But a year later, based on the reports, we came up with a list of proposed indicators. Based on countries' capacity and also their experience, we decided to come up with 2 types of lists. One is a more mandatory recommended list that would really capture the basic indicators on number of people displaced, types of displacement, duration. But we also opted to include certain optional indicators that would give us different aspects of displacement particularly shedding light on patterns, losses and damages, and pathways to realizing durable solutions. So these are, for our opinion, optional, but we do call for countries to really aim for the mandatory recommended list of indicators that, like I said, would cover primarily 4 types of indications on duration, types, number, and damages sustained on housing. So you can see the full list by clicking or scanning your phones using the QR code. So now let me move on to, based on this experience, why do I isolate the Philippines and Indonesia? Now, in Asia Pacific, as I mentioned, countries have made quite substantial progress when it comes to reporting disaster impacts, and specifically on displacement. Countries are also piloting different ways of reporting, trying to make those reporting sustainable in the region. And 2 countries in Southeast Asia have stood out when we did our mapping of how countries are doing based on IOM-IDMC's proposed list of indicators. Now, these 2 countries stood out not only because they are reporting on the mandatory indicators, but they're also able to report quite substantially and systematically on the optional indicators that we proposed. So let me show you what that actually means. Starting with Indonesia. Now, Indonesia's National Board for Disaster Management, Badan Nasional Penanggulangan Bencana, the BNPB, it is the country's central governing body for all disaster-related activities. So they coordinate all disaster-related activities from point A to point Z, meaning they're overseeing DRR, disaster risk reduction, as well as DRM, disaster risk mitigation efforts. A part of these efforts do include information management and collection. As a decentralized country, operations are not implemented by the national body, but by subnational counterparts, namely the provincial and local disaster management agencies, the BPBD. These are the agencies mandated to execute DRM and DRR functions in their respective jurisdictions. So part of these execution does involve, again, information management and collection. There are 2 channels that allow for this information to be managed. One is in the form of situation reports. These are narratives. And you also have information management done through a disaster management portal. I'm going to show you how they look like in practice. This is an example of a situation report where you have information on number of people being forced to evacuate, some indication on duration of displacement. As you can see, it is noted that residents, some of which were able to return to their home quite swiftly after being displaced. Now, this kind of situation report not only gives us the data points that we need to understand displacement, they also do complement the data with context, giving us a better picture on what patterns are associated with this displacement, potentially even explaining duration of displacement, further on providing optional and complementary information on the kind of assistance provided during the course of the incident. On the other hand, you also need very data-friendly and navigable information, and that is currently couched in the Data Information Disaster Indonesia portal, the DB. So this is a portal that is in real time. It tracks the different incidents occurring across the different countries. When you zoom in onto the specific incident or disaster, you do get a breakdown of all impacts associated with the disaster as recommended under the Sendai framework. So you have number of fatalities, people missing, people injured, and also specifically for displacement, you have a section on displacement. Other complementary information on impacts such as housing destruction, couched under RUMA, additional impacts on critical infrastructure such as education, health, and other critical infrastructure is also captured here. It is a very accessible and real-time data portal that allows for information to be communicated between BNPB and BPPD. So these are two ways in which BNPB manages information on disasters and also dedicates resources to compiling information specific to displacement. One important aspect in terms of systematic reporting is the fact that this information is updated in real time. Situation reports are provided daily, and at the end of each week, you also have any changes, updates, and validation that is provided to kind of give you the most up-to-date data on displacement. Very similarly, in the Philippines, you also have a national central body managing DRR and DRM. And in the case of the Philippines, we have the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, the NDRRMC. So it is also tasked with information management and updates, and the executing body to compile, curate, consolidate data on impacts of disasters, including displacement, is DROMIC, the Disaster Response Operations Monitoring and Information Center. Very similar to Indonesia, and this information is real-time. It is provided on a daily basis, but they do also go a little bit beyond by sometimes providing twice-a-day update for specific large-scale disasters. What is also quite unique compared to Indonesia is that this information that they provide not only gives you the total number of people displaced, but it also tracks number of people currently displaced over time, allowing for not just spatial comparisons, but also temporal comparisons. And this reporting tends to last for weeks, months, or even up to years, depending on the scale of the disaster. Like Indonesia, there are two channels or ways in which this information is communicated, again, through situation reports and through data points through a dashboard. Let me show you what the dashboard typically looks like. Here you have the dashboard providing really a quick overview of a particular disaster. Specific to displacement, you do have types of displacements being captured here. Preemptive evacuation, people inside evacuation centers, people outside evacuation centers. And as well as that, not only the total number of people evacuated, but also the current number of people evacuated in these different locations. So this is quite unique compared to Indonesia that only focuses on the total number of people displaced for an event. Here you do have the over time, the number of people being recorded as displaced. What is also quite unique for the case of the Philippines is the disaggregation by evacuation centers and outside. So this is one of the very few countries that actually tracks people not only living in relief centers, but also seeking refuge outside of relief centers. And these typically refer to people staying with host family, with their own family, or in homes of their friends. Furthermore, you also can see that there are other critical complementary or optional information provided on damages to infrastructure. And if you go into the website, you would be able to see also more optional information on the kind of assistance provided throughout the course of the disaster. Here is just another very quick snapshot of the situation reports, how you have some narrative provided. And to complement that narrative, rather than having a dashboard or a data card, as in the case of Indonesia, where you have actual data points through a portal, in the case of the Philippines, your data is tabular. These are accessible through the situation reports directly, and they do give you a very, very detailed breakdown of the different indicators by total people displaced, so in the come column, and the current number of people displaced under the now column. This is disaggregated spatially, so you have very disaggregated information up to the municipality level. Same kind of breakdown offered for destroyed and damaged housing, and a specific table providing also preemptive evacuations by region. So a wealth of information is being captured in terms of disaster displacement reporting in these two countries, though the modalities could be quite different from these from each other. Basically, both countries fare quite well in terms of coverage, in terms of the matrix that they report, the consistency of the reporting and its scope. In going into a little bit more detail, the coverage here I'm talking about is the coverage at the spatial level. So in Indonesia, you have information provided up till admin 2 at the Regency level. In the Philippines, disaggregation spatially is up to admin 3, so up to the municipality level. In both countries, they do have very strong, solid indicators on displacement. So basically, they both report on the total number of people evacuated, displaced. They also report on the total number of impacts on destroyed and damaged housing. But Philippines also, on top of those total cumulative numbers, they report on the actual number of people currently in displacement, either both in evacuation centers and outside. In both countries, again, the systematic reporting is key. Indonesia, like I said, has daily real-time updates. All updates are revised at the end of each week. What is slightly different in the Philippines is that the reports are daily and can last up to months or years, depending on the scale of the disaster. Finally, both countries do offer quite extensive optional indicators reporting specifically on other impacts, specifically on also the assistance offered, which helps you understand a little bit the aspect of losses and damages incurred through this disaster and subsequently the displacement. Obviously, these countries are doing very well when it comes to reporting on disaster displacement. And there are certain improvements that these countries have also started to undertake when it comes to offering more disaggregation and more systematic reporting. Specifically for Indonesia, they have, as of last year, started to do the temporal reporting. So for large-scale events, they do offer, maybe not daily like the Philippines, but different at different time points, the number of people still remaining displaced. This does help us to estimate duration of displacement over the different points in time. On top of that, for select instances as well, they do offer sex and age disaggregation. The same goes for the Philippines. While they do very good temporal reporting on stocks, so number of people still displaced, recently, as of last year, they've also started to implement and report more and more consistently on sex and age disaggregation, both in and outside of camps, which are quite a promising way forward. So I don't have a lot of time, but in the 20 minutes that I've been given, I hope that my presentation met the following objectives. I really wanted to start by explaining and having you appreciate the importance and relevance of displacement data, and also for you to identify what are actually important indicators to know when it comes to managing displacement risks. So number, the scale, the type of displacement, duration of displacement are some really mandatory information that needs to be collected. But there are also certain nice to have or optional indicators that as countries refine their reporting, they can consider collecting. I also hope by using the example from Indonesia and the Philippines, that there is an inspiration to colleagues in the field who are in a position to collect such information, to have a sense of the variety of approaches that different countries have to install more systematic ways of reporting on disaster displacement. Now, I want to end by also flagging that the IOM and IDMC, we are committed to supporting country efforts to really lead and have state leadership over reporting under the Sendai framework. specifically when it also comes to disaster displacement. Now, through our work in defining and proposing a list of indicators, we've also supported country efforts to try and implement the reporting based on that list. And this implementation of the pilot was done last year in 4 countries, of which Indonesia and the Philippines are 2 pilot countries. So we are committed to expanding piloting of the disaster displacement indicators beyond the region to different countries in different contexts. And we really hope that we will continue to support country efforts to really make disaster displacement reporting more systematic. Now, with that, let me thank you very much for your interest and participation this afternoon, and hand over to Victor to facilitate any questions and comments you may have based on this presentation. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Dr. Lechmi, for that very illuminating presentation on capturing displacement-related data to better understand the complex impacts disaster have on displacement patterns. Your examples from Indonesia and the Philippines highlight promising efforts towards systematic and consistent reporting in alignment with the Sendai framework. We look forward to collaborating on ways to further refine disaster displacement indicators and enhance reporting capabilities across countries in the Asia and the Pacific, both in disaster and climate change contexts. Now, I would like to open the floor for questions for either Mr. Meliker or Dr. Lechmi. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Please use the Zoom raise hand feature if you would like to ask a question directly. Once called on, please unmute yourselves. Alternatively, you may send questions via the Zoom Q&A box. Whilst we will prioritize direct questions, we will also address those submitted in writing. To open this Q&A session, I would just like to ask Dr. Lechmi the first question. So whilst I do that, feel free to raise your hand or submit your question via the Q&A box. With regard to data collection on disaster displacement, particularly big data, which comes with significant ethical and rights-related risks, how does IDMC ensure that safeguards are in place to protect people's right to privacy and security, especially in countries where such data could be misused and abused for surveillance, censorship, suppression, or persecution?
Right, thank you, Victor, for kickstarting the Q&A session. And this is a very, very important question to be asked at this point in time, especially in the current context of today, where data is very easily accessible and available and may not necessarily respect all data privacy laws that should be respected to safeguard the rights and confidentiality of very sensitive information. Now, for IDMC, we do practice a do no harm principle that is very strictly practiced. We are not an organization that does primary data collection, but we do work with organizations that do primary data collections, and we ensure that a do no harm principle is strictly practiced. We also adhere to the IASC operational guidelines on data responsibility in humanitarian action, which really promotes safe, ethical, and effective management of personal as well as non-personal data for operational response. So when we make our data publicly available, we do make a very conscious effort and very concerted effort to remove any personal identification information that can be used to track, persecute potentially people who are displaced. And it's with really close partnership with our agencies that respect the strict adherence of the IAS operational guidelines that we can make a huge difference in improving the ethical, safe, and effective management of data for operational purposes. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much for that very insightful answer. This is, of course, a very relevant question that's come up a number of times in different forums when you talk about data. So very good. It sounds very promising that that IDMC has checks and balances in place and policies in place to safeguard people's right to privacy. I can see that there's a question from an anonymous participant in the Q&A box. Have you noticed a commonality among countries experiencing difficulty in reporting on displacement, and what could be the reason behind it?
I missed the first part of the questions. Sorry, Victor, could you repeat?
So have you noticed a commonality among countries experiencing difficulty in reporting on displacement? And what could be the reason behind it?
Thank you. That is clear now. So the commonality across different countries who are currently reporting. Well, one biggest commonality is, of course, capacity. Depending on the level of capacities countries have, also as well as their exposure to disaster, their capacity can be quite varied when it comes to reporting. In a region such as Asia and the Pacific, which is quite exposed to a lot of disasters, there is awareness and there is also this exposure to disasters that is being properly tracked. Whether that tracking extends to displacement tends to be quite varied, because in many countries there is no clear definition on how they understand displacement. Displacement tends to have quite it tends to be a loaded term in many country contexts, and they don't necessarily associate displacement with the different forms that I explained. Temporary displacement as a result of lack of access to critical infrastructure and services. Preemptive evacuation can also be considered displacement, and actually a lot of countries in Asia and Pacific do practice preemptive evacuation. And so it's through these differences in terms that the collection of information on displacement tends to get watered down, and it's not very easy to quickly grasp what kind of movement is being reported. So I think commonality really comes down to their experience and the capacities countries have in reporting on disaster displacement in general. I do want to end by saying that Asia and the Pacific is really a country where there is huge state ownership and leadership in collecting all disaster relevant impacts and information, of which displacement is a small part. But compared to other regions, this region is quite advanced when it comes to acknowledging and recognizing the importance of displacement when it comes to disaster management.
Thank you so much. And I can see that we have received a number of questions. I'll just send them in tranches. So just take notes. So this is a question from Mr. Christian. Has there been any policy on local governments units and how they should cater to displaced population, both the evacuated LGU and the receiving LGU? And then the second question from Miss Hutmauli. Is there any information from both countries to describe the internal displacement caused by climate change situation, considered the impact of climate change is quite difficult to define as direct disasters that can be documented directly as other disasters? And then the third one is from LB. Thank you for providing the link. Okay, so he's thanking you for providing the link. In deciding to focus on a particular set of indicators, can you please elaborate on how these indicators are supported by specific country studies? And feel free to let me know if I need to repeat any of these questions.
Yes, there I have it. So I've noted the question. I might ask to clarify the last question a little bit, but let me get started with the first two. So do I know if there is any policy that caters to different groups of people and how different LGUs coordinate in terms of information management and response? So the example I can give you, which is quite typical in both Indonesia and the Philippines, is when this information on impacts of displacement as well as impacts of disasters are compiled by local NGOs, and this information is communicated back to central or national government units. This information is necessary to help mobilize resources, especially in the context of large-scale disasters. Having this information timely being recorded and reported back up the command channel will help have visibility and overview of the level of responses and support that will be necessary, that needs to be mobilized to react to different types of displacement. So the example I can give you is also in the case of a large-scale disaster, you do have a large group of people displaced, but this displacement can take various forms. You might have a huge group of people who are displaced as a result of preemptive evacuation, and you would expect this group of people, if damages sustained are not elevated, for them to return back to their homes. So a lot of the mobilization efforts would be to support verification of the impacts to their housing, impacts to the infrastructure, so that you can quickly and speedily facilitate return back to different homes in the different municipalities or in the different regencies. Now, the second question is on climate change-induced displacement. Indeed, there is very few reports that directly link mobility to climate change. Typically, what we see is the climate change is manifesting in two types of ways. One is through sudden onset hazards that most of you are familiar with. These are extreme weather-related instances, or the frequency of these of weather-related events tends to be increased, and their scale is also, it's not just frequency, but also intensity of these events tend to be augmented. So this, by understanding how these events tend to be quite extreme, can help you understand or appreciate how climate change may have induced displacement in these very specific situations. But typically, what you tend to associate also with climate change very often is the occurrence of slow onset disasters. Things that happen very gradually, coastal erosion, sea level rise. It's not something that people can visualize. It's not something that is very tangible. And indeed, given the nature of this kind of impact or manifestation of these hazards, it does remain quite a challenge to monitor and report on any subsequent movement that could potentially be linked to this initial trigger. What typically happens, and what some countries are doing, is rather than monitoring the slow onset hazard directly, what we are looking at, and this is also the approach adopted by RICD, is to look at those tipping points, those triggers that spark the eventual or subsequent movement. And these triggers manifest through very tangible ways. When it comes to drought, it could be, lack of water sources for drinking purposes. It could be lack of livelihoods, as pastoralists or agriculturalists no longer able to grow their land because there is water scarcity in those areas as a result of persistent drought. So by looking at how these slow onset hazards manifest on people's lives, livelihoods, their access to basic necessities, all this can help us form a much more comprehensive picture on how eventual movements occur and how this can be tied back to climate change. Now, on the last question, how indicators are being supported by country studies, I am guessing you are referring to how different countries report on displacement indicators and how they differ across different contexts. So maybe I would require just clarification on that last question. Victor, could you reread the question to see if I captured it correctly?
Sure. So in deciding to focus on a particular set of indicators, can you please elaborate on how these indicators are supported by specific country studies?
Okay, so the particular set of indicators then would refer to the 4 recommended indicators, I'm guessing, on the number of people displaced preemptively, during and after, number of houses destroyed, and the last one was duration of displacement. So I'm focusing on these 4 and how these have been supported by different countries, country studies. Well, to identify which are some of the countries that are reporting quite systematically on these 4 indicators, we did, together when IOM embarked on a mapping exercise, our focus was primarily on Southeast Asia, because there was an intent to look at Southeast Asian countries to decide which countries we would identify for the pilot piloting initiative of our IOM and IDMC's list of indicators. So based on that, what we did was to go through every existing data source to see how they were currently reported, whether that reporting was systematic or ad hoc, partial, no reporting at all. And based on that, we tried to map it to the different ways that we would recommend reporting for disaster displacement to be. So for the countries that I mentioned today, Indonesia and the Philippines, you would appreciate that there is no one data source, while there is one management central authority managing DRR, DRM, as well as information management efforts. The way or the modality of this information is coming from different forums. And so appreciation of when doing this kind of country exercise is really to have a comprehensive view of the different existing data sources in the country, whether it's at national or subnational level, and to try to kind of put up the puzzle together to see how these different data forms can be used to report under the proposed list of indicators. It is not an easy task, and this is something IDMC is pretty proud of, that we have gotten to do quite well in the last couple of years. Our monitoring of displacement over 183 country and different contexts does allow us to have a bird's eye view of the different data sources within a country. And based on these data sources, what we eventually come up with is a comprehensive estimate of displacement in the different countries. So I'm happy to share my presentation, providing you already with the links that you can access at your own leisure, the different data sources and how these data sources are visualized in different contexts. So maybe that could also give you a better sense of the country experiences that I've touched upon today.
I can see that we have a couple of more questions in the chat box, but we are quickly hitting the end of this session, and this has been a very interesting discussion. We will take note of the questions that are in the chat box as well as in the Q&A box. And please feel free to leave your email addresses if you want to my colleague Ms. Arge Louise Joy. And hopefully Dr. Lechmi will be able to get back to you or respond to your questions in writing following this webinar. I'd like to turn things over to Shireen, my colleague, for a group photo. For those of you who want to take part, please turn on your cameras.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for joining. We would like to invite everyone to just stay on for a minute or so for a group picture. So what I'll do is I'll count down. So if you like to be a part of the pictures, just turn on your cameras. But if you don't feel comfortable doing that, that's totally fine too. You can just stay on the screen. So what I'll do is I'll count down from 3 to 1, and we just give our biggest smile. And because we have quite a lot of participants, we have more than 100 today. So I'll just ask you guys to hold your smiles for like 20 seconds or so as I go through each page. So okay, you can see everyone smiling already. That's so nice. Okay, so get ready. 3, 2, 1, smile. Okay, I got everyone now. Over back to you, Victor.
All right, thank you so much, Shireen, for that. As we conclude this inaugural webinar, I want to thank you all for contributing to this rich and informative discussion. We look forward to seeing you in future webinars under the Co-Creation Hub. Should you have questions about today's presentations, please feel free to reach out to us or to Dr. Lechmi at the email addresses displayed on the screen. Before we close, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. Please take a moment to complete the evaluation form by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking on the link in the chat box. Your feedback will help us refine future sessions to be as relevant and informative as possible. Please let me know if you have any problems accessing the form. It should take around 2 to 3 minutes to complete. Thank you. All right. With that, I wish you all a pleasant day, and I would like to give a special thanks to my colleagues at UPRI, AIT, as well as IOM and Dr. Lechmi for joining us today and making this a very informative session. I look forward to welcoming you all to the next Brown Bag webinar, which will be announced shortly. Thank you, everyone. Bye.